My name is Nora Whitmore. I am 42 years old. I work as a property manager in Michigan, and I have spent the better part of 2 decades building a life carefully, quietly, and responsibly. I manage rental properties for 3 different owners across 2 counties. I pay my bills on time. I maintain my own small investment account. I show up when I say I will. I am not dramatic. I am not paranoid. I am not someone who looks for trouble or invents problems where none exist. I tell you this because what I am about to describe is the kind of story that sounds impossible until you understand that it happened to someone exactly like me, someone ordinary, someone careful, someone who trusted the wrong person for far too long. The night my sister tried to kill me started exactly the way 1,000 ordinary evenings start. It started with a toast. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell so you never miss the next one. Every share helps these stories reach someone who needs to hear them. Let's keep the conversation going. We were at a restaurant we both liked, a quiet Italian place near the waterfront. My sister Brianna had suggested it. She said she wanted to celebrate. She had been through a difficult few months, and she told me things were finally starting to look up. She wanted to mark the moment. She lifted her wine glass and smiled at me across the table. The candlelight caught the rim and threw small reflections across the white tablecloth. To new beginnings, she said. I lifted my glass. We drank. The wine tasted fine. Slightly bitter, maybe, but I assumed it was the variety. I had never been particularly skilled at identifying wine. 10 minutes later, I could not feel my fingers. The sensation started at the tips and moved upward through my hands. The room began to tilt gently at the edges. My chest felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with the food. I tried to stand. My legs folded beneath me like paper. The last thing I remember clearly was Brianna catching my arm. Not panicked, not calling for help. Just steady and quiet, watching my face with an expression I could not read. Then the darkness came all at once. I woke up staring at white ceiling tiles and fluorescent light bars. The light was too bright. My throat felt raw. There were tubes attached to my left arm and a monitor clipped to my finger. A nurse appeared at my side and told me I was lucky. She used the word extremely. She said it twice. The toxicology results showed high levels of benzodiazepines in my system. Enough, the attending physician later told me, to stop my breathing if I had not received treatment when I did. I had not taken anything. Not a pill, not a tablet, not a supplement. Nothing. The nurse told me a man had brought me to the emergency room entrance, helped a staff member get me inside, and then left without giving his name or waiting for any information. Security footage showed him clearly. When the detective assigned to my case described him to me the following morning, my stomach dropped completely. The description matched a contractor named Felix, a man I had fired from a property management job 8 weeks earlier after discovering he had been falsifying invoices and skimming repair funds. 2 detectives came to my hospital room the morning after I was admitted. They were polite and methodical. They asked background questions first. About my health, my medications, whether I had any known enemies, whether I had been in any recent conflicts. I told them no to most of it. Then they asked about Brianna specifically. Had we argued recently? Was there any tension between us? I said no. We had been getting along better than we had in years, I told them. She had been stressed about money, but I had not seen anything alarming. Then the younger detective set a document on the tray table in front of me. It was a bank withdrawal record. Brianna had withdrawn $20,000 in cash from her personal savings account the day before I was poisoned. When investigators spoke to her, she told them it was for home renovations. I stared at that number on the page for a long time. Brianna did not own a home that needed any significant renovation. She rented a 2-bedroom apartment on the west side of the city. She had rented it for 3 years. I was discharged 4 days after I was admitted. My neighbor Constance picked me up and drove me home. I sat in the passenger seat looking at ordinary streets in ordinary morning light and felt completely disoriented, not because anything around me had changed, but because I understood, somewhere deep and certain, that everything had. I called Brianna that afternoon. I kept my voice normal. I told her I was home and feeling better. She came over within the hour, moving quickly through my front door with her arms open. She cried. She cried hard, with her shoulders shaking and her face buried in her hands. She said she had been terrified. She said she had barely slept. She said she could not imagine who would do something like this. She blamed Felix entirely. She said he must have put something in my drink when she stepped away to use the restroom. It was logical. It was detailed. It was delivered with exactly the right amount of trembling in her voice. For a moment, a real moment, I almost believed her. Then she pulled me into a hug. Her mouth was close to my ear, and she whispered, so quietly I almost thought I had imagined it, "No one is going to believe this story, Nora." That was not fear. That was confidence. I did not react. I pulled back from the hug and looked at her face. She was already composed again, eyes still damp, expression soft and worried. Whatever had slipped out in that whisper was already buried back beneath the performance. After she left, I sat alone in my kitchen for a long time. Then I called my attorney. The following day, I called a forensic accountant my attorney recommended. I also quietly reviewed our parents' estate documents, something I had not looked at in several years. Our parents had passed within 18 months of each other. The estate had been split evenly between Brianna and me, with one additional clause I had not thought much about at the time. If one daughter predeceased the other, the surviving daughter inherited the remaining share in full. The trust, the investment accounts, the lake house on the northern shore that our father had spent 15 years paying off. I also learned, through a mutual acquaintance, that Brianna had lost her job 4 months ago. I had just signed a major contract expansion with 2 new property owners that had increased my income significantly. I sat with all of that information and felt something cold and clear settle in my chest. 1 week after I was discharged, I drove to Brianna's apartment unannounced. I told myself I was just checking on her. I parked across the street and sat in the car for a moment before going in. That was when I heard voices coming from the direction of the parking garage attached to her building. The door to the garage was propped open with a cinder block. I recognized Brianna's voice first. She was not calm. She was snapping at someone in a low, furious tone. "It was supposed to look accidental," she said. A man's voice responded, quieter, shaking slightly. "You almost killed her." Silence. Then Brianna spoke again. Her voice had dropped to something flat and cold and utterly controlled. She was ruining everything. I stood on the sidewalk outside that propped open door and felt the ground shift under my feet. Not metaphorically. I actually reached out and put my hand against the wall to steady myself. I walked back to my car. I drove 3 blocks away and pulled over. I sat there until my hands stopped shaking enough to dial my attorney. The forensic accountant my attorney had hired completed his preliminary report within 2 weeks. What he found was not a woman who had hit a rough patch. What he found was a financial collapse that had been building quietly for years. Brianna had accumulated over $400,000 in debt. Gambling losses spread across multiple online platforms and 2 out-of-state casinos. Secret credit cards opened under a slightly different version of her name. A second mortgage taken out on a property she had co-owned briefly with a former partner and then quietly defaulted on. She had been drowning. Not struggling, drowning. The kind of debt that does not get resolved through better budgeting or a new job. The kind that requires a completely different solution. I was her solution. I had been the life raft she was swimming toward while smiling at me across restaurant tables and toasting to new beginnings. I read the accountant's report twice. Then I filed it in the locked cabinet in my home office alongside the estate documents and the toxicology report from the hospital. I was building something. I just needed one more piece. Felix was arrested 6 weeks after the poisoning on separate fraud charges, a different client, a different scheme, but the same pattern of falsified invoices and skimmed funds. Facing significant prison time, he agreed to speak with prosecutors under a formal cooperation agreement. He admitted that Brianna had paid him $20,000 in cash. He said she approached him 3 weeks after I had fired him. She told him I had become unstable and had been hinting at harming myself. She said she needed someone to help stage something that would look like an accidental overdose. In my car, she had specified, because it would seem more consistent with the story she intended to tell about my mental state. He said I had collapsed faster than either of them anticipated. He panicked. Rather than leaving me in the car, he brought me to the emergency room and fled before anyone could get his name. His confession was detailed, consistent, and given under formal legal supervision. But it was not enough on its own. There was no written agreement between them. No text messages investigators could find. No bank records directly linking the cash withdrawal to Felix. Brianna denied everything. She told investigators that Felix was fabricating the story to reduce his own sentence. The case stalled, and Brianna began calling relatives to say I was having a breakdown. While investigators worked their side, my attorney and the forensic accountant continued working theirs. The accountant found something in Brianna's financial records that had not appeared in the initial review. Regular payments to a self-storage facility on the east side of the city, going back about 8 months. The payments were small and consistent. They had been coded in her records under a generic label. Investigators obtained a warrant. Inside the storage unit were several boxes of personal items, a prepaid phone still in its original packaging, and a spiral-bound notebook. Most of the notebook was filled with numbers, debt figures, it appeared, listed and crossed out and relisted. Calculations. Timelines. Near the back, on a page that had been circled 3 times in red pen, was a single sentence. Asterisk after Nora. Everything resets. Asterisk. My name was written again below it, underlined twice. I was not present when investigators found the notebook. My attorney called me that evening and read me the sentence over the phone. I sat in my kitchen and did not speak for a long time after he finished. Brianna moved quickly when she sensed the investigation was tightening. She reached out to relatives first, cousins and aunt, 2 family friends who had known us since childhood. She told them I had become paranoid since our parents passed. She said grief had affected me more deeply than anyone realized. She said I was fabricating evidence because I wanted attention, or money, or both. She said she was worried about me. Some of them believed her. Or at least, they believed her enough to pull back from me. Phone calls became shorter. A cousin I had been close to stopped responding to my messages entirely for several weeks. Losing family support hurt in a way that was almost separate from everything else, a different kind of wound, quieter but persistent. I had expected the legal fight. I had not fully prepared for the loneliness of being called a liar by people who had watched me grow up. I kept working. I kept documenting. I kept showing up to my attorney's office and to every meeting the investigators requested. And then something happened that none of us had anticipated. Felix had a cousin named Darnell who had done occasional work for him over the years, small jobs, nothing that put him in any legal trouble. Darnell had kept his distance from the whole situation once Felix was arrested. He had not come forward voluntarily. But Darnell had a voicemail on his phone. Brianna had called Felix's number at some point during the weeks before the poisoning, not realizing that Felix had recently given his old phone to Darnell temporarily while his own was being repaired. The call went to Darnell's voicemail. Brianna left a message. Her voice on the recording was steady and controlled. There was no panic, no warmth, nothing that could be mistaken for casual conversation. "Make sure it's done," she said. "I can't have this dragging on." Darnell had not deleted it. He came forward after seeing a local news report about the case and realizing what he was holding. Investigators authenticated the voicemail within 48 hours. The number it originated from matched Brianna's phone records exactly. That recording changed everything. Police reopened the investigation formally and moved quickly after the voicemail was authenticated. The case that had stalled for weeks suddenly had the anchor it needed. Brianna was arrested on a Tuesday morning. 2 detectives went to her apartment. She was brought out in handcuffs in front of her neighbors. She screamed as they led her to the car. Not at the detectives. And me, or rather, at the idea of me, because I was not there. She screamed that I was destroying the family. That I was a liar. That I had manufactured everything out of jealousy and spite. The neighbors watched from doorways and windows. I heard about all of this from my attorney, who called me within an hour of the arrest. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. I listened to everything he told me without saying much. When he finished, I thanked him and ended the call. Then I sat in the quiet of my kitchen and let myself breathe for the first time in months. Not fully, not freely. The road ahead was still long. But the arrest meant the story I had been carrying alone was finally being carried by the legal system the way it was supposed to be. Brianna's attorney moved fast once she was charged. Within 2 weeks, a counter-narrative began circulating, not just through family channels, but in the local press. An anonymous source, whom I had no doubt was connected to her defense, began suggesting that I had orchestrated the poisoning myself. The theory, as reported in a brief online article, was that I had staged the incident to collect insurance money or to gain sympathy ahead of a property dispute. I had no active insurance claim. There was no property dispute. Neither of these facts stopped the story from spreading briefly through social media. For a short and genuinely difficult period, I watched people I did not know debate whether I was a victim or a fraud in comment sections. My attorney told me to stay off social media entirely. I did. And then prosecutors uncovered something that made the counter-narrative collapse completely. Brianna had taken out 2 separate life insurance policies on me. The first was opened 14 months before the poisoning. The second was opened 4 months later. Both listed her as the sole beneficiary. Both had been opened without my knowledge, using personal information about me that she would have had access to through years of being my sister, my emergency contact, and a frequent presence in my home. Neither policy had been discovered in the initial investigation, because they had been opened through a smaller regional insurer and filed under a slightly different formatting of my full legal name. The combined payout if I had died would have been substantial, layered on top of whatever she would have inherited through the estate. This had never been only about the inheritance. The poisoning had been designed to pay out on 2 separate tracks simultaneously. When prosecutors introduced this evidence in pretrial hearings, the courtroom went audibly quiet for a moment. I was not present for that hearing. My attorney called me afterward and described the reaction in the room. I sat with the phone against my ear and thought about the toast. To new beginnings. The trial began on a gray Monday in late autumn. I sat in the gallery with Constance beside me, and I watched my sister take her place at the defense table in a dark blazer with her hair pulled back neatly. She looked smaller than I remembered. Softer. She testified in her own defense. Her attorney had clearly prepared her carefully. She spoke in a quiet, measured voice. She looked at the jury directly. She said she loved me. She said the idea that she would hurt her own sister was incomprehensible to her. She said she had spent her whole life protecting me, and the suggestion that she had done otherwise was the most painful accusation she had ever faced. She cried on the stand. Not the hard, theatrical crying she had performed in my living room after the poisoning. This was quieter, more controlled, more convincing in a way, because it looked more like real grief. I watched her from across the courtroom and remembered us as children, sharing a bedroom, staying up late talking, the way she used to bring me soup when I was sick. Then the prosecutor stood up. He walked to the audio equipment at the front of the courtroom. He pressed play. Brianna's voice filled the room. Asterisk, make sure it's done. I can't have this dragging on, asterisk. Everyone in the courtroom had assumed that Brianna's husband, Marcus, would testify in her defense. They had been married for 9 years. He had stood beside her publicly throughout the investigation. His attorney had made quiet noises about spousal privilege. He did not testify for the defense. He testified for the prosecution. Marcus took the stand and spoke in a flat, careful voice, as if he had rehearsed staying calm and was succeeding only through significant effort. He said that several months before the poisoning, Brianna had asked him a specific question one evening while they were watching television. She had asked how long sedative medications typically remain detectable in a person's bloodstream after ingestion. He said he had thought she was doing research for a novel. She had mentioned wanting to write fiction before. He had looked it up on his phone and told her what he found. He said it was only after her arrest that he understood what she had actually been asking. His voice did not break while he testified, but his hands gripped the railing of the witness box so tightly that his knuckles went pale. He did not look at Brianna once during his entire time on the stand. The notebook from the storage unit was entered into evidence and examined formally by two independent handwriting experts. Both confirmed, separately and without knowledge of each other's conclusions, that the handwriting throughout the notebook matched Brianna's known samples: personal letters, signed documents, forms from her employment file. Every page, including the final one. After Nora, everything resets. The prosecutor read that sentence aloud during his closing argument. He read it slowly, and then he paused for a long moment before continuing. The courtroom was completely silent during that pause. I had heard that sentence before, in my attorney's voice over the phone on the evening it was discovered. But hearing it spoken aloud in a courtroom, in front of a jury, surrounded by all the evidence that had been assembled piece by piece over months, it landed differently. It landed with the full weight of what it meant. She had not been planning to hurt me in a moment of rage or desperation. She had been planning it methodically, over time, writing it down, circling it in red pen, storing the evidence of her own intentions in a rented unit she paid for quietly every month. She had planned to erase me completely, and then start over. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I spent those 2 days at home. I could not focus on work. I could not read. I walked through my house doing small, purposeless tasks, rearranging things on shelves, washing dishes that were already clean, standing in the back garden in the cold looking at nothing in particular. Constance stayed with me for most of it. She did not try to fill the silence with reassurance, which was exactly the right thing to do. On the second afternoon, my attorney called. The jury had reached a verdict. I drove to the courthouse and sat in the gallery and watched the forewoman stand. I watched her unfold the paper. I watched her look at it for a half second before she looked up. Guilty. Conspiracy to commit murder. Attempted homicide. I did not cry. I had thought I might. I had imagined this moment many times over the preceding months, and in most of those imagined versions, I cried. Instead, I exhaled. One long, slow breath. Like something I had been holding since the moment I woke up in the hospital staring at fluorescent lights. Sentencing was 3 weeks after the verdict. The courtroom was full. I sat in the front row of the gallery with my attorney beside me and Constance on my other side. The judge spoke before announcing the sentence. He described the crime as a calculated betrayal, premeditated over a significant period of time, and motivated entirely by financial greed. He noted the insurance policies. He noted the forged property documents. He noted the notebook and the voicemail and the deliberate use of a third party to carry out the act. He sentenced Brianna to 10 years in prison. As the correctional officers moved to escort her out, she turned and looked at the gallery. She found my face. There was no apology in her expression. No grief. No remorse. There was only anger. Cold, clean, concentrated anger that she had failed. I held her gaze until she looked away. Until they led her through the door at the side of the courtroom, and the door closed behind her and she was gone. I sat still for a moment. Then I picked up my bag and walked outside into the gray afternoon light. 3 months after sentencing, I filed a civil lawsuit against Brianna for medical expenses, lost income during the investigation period, and emotional damages. The civil standard of proof is lower than criminal, and the criminal conviction provided substantial foundation. The case did not go to trial. Her attorneys reached out about settlement within 6 weeks of the filing. We negotiated through our respective legal teams. The final agreement was documented, signed, and sealed. I won. Legally, formally, and on the public record. The settlement meant that her financial obligation to me would continue long after her prison sentence ended. Whatever assets she retained, whatever income she eventually earned, a portion of it would come to me for years. She had tried to use money as the instrument of my death. Money had become the instrument of her long accountability. I did not celebrate this privately or publicly. It was not a cause for celebration. It was simply a correct outcome, documented and filed and finished. I added the settlement agreement to the locked cabinet in my home office, next to the toxicology report from the hospital and the estate documents and the accountant's file. I had inherited a half share of our parents' lake house years earlier, and after the trial concluded, I made the decision to sell it. It was a beautiful property. Our father had spent 15 years paying it off and had been proud of it in a quiet, steady way. There were good memories attached to it. Summers when we were young, evenings on the dock, the particular smell of the water in early morning. But Brianna's shadow was on every room of it. Her name was on the original inheritance documents. It had been part of what she was reaching for when she lifted that wine glass and smiled at me across a restaurant table. I could not be there without knowing that. I worked with a realtor and sold it within 4 months of the sentencing. The process was clean and straightforward. I closed the transaction on a Thursday afternoon and signed the final papers in a real estate office on the second floor of a building downtown. I drove home and made dinner and watched the evening news. That chapter was closed. I was ready for it to be. 8 months after sentencing, a letter arrived from the correctional facility. Brianna's handwriting on the envelope. My name and address in blue ink. I sat with it on the kitchen table for a while before opening it. The letter was 2 pages long. She wrote about stress. She wrote about the gambling, framing it as an illness that had taken over her life without her fully realizing it. She wrote about the debt as something that had made her feel like she was trapped in a room with no doors. She wrote that she had not been herself. She did not apologize. Not once in 2 pages. The word sorry did not appear anywhere. What the letter was, underneath all the careful language, was an explanation. A request to be understood. Perhaps a request to be forgiven without the word being used. I read it twice. Then I carried it to the kitchen sink. I burned it. I watched the paper curl and blacken and turn to ash under the faucet. Then I rinsed the sink clean and went to bed. In the year following the trial, I used a significant portion of the civil settlement to establish a small support initiative. I worked with a social services organization in the city that already had infrastructure in place. The program I funded focused specifically on victims of financial manipulation within family systems, people who had been defrauded, coerced, or exploited by relatives, and who often did not have access to legal resources or knew how to document what had happened to them. It was not a grand gesture. It was not a foundation with my name on a building. It was a practical fund providing legal consultation access and financial documentation support to people who needed it. My attorney helped me structure it correctly. Constance helped me draft the initial communications to partner organizations. I was not trying to turn my experience into a story about triumph. I was trying to make sure that what had happened to me was useful to someone. That something built out of that year of fear and grief and isolation could do something real in the world. That felt like the only form of resolution that was actually clean. A year after the sentencing, I drove to the correctional facility on a Tuesday morning. I had not told anyone I was going. Not my attorney, not Constance. I made the appointment through the facility's visitor system, and I went alone. We sat across from each other at a metal table in a visiting room with pale green walls and overhead lighting that reminded me of the hospital ceiling I had woken up staring at. Brianna looked the same and also completely different. Same face. Different eyes, flatter, more careful, stripped of the performance she had always wrapped herself in. I did not come with a speech. I had thought about what I wanted to say for weeks, and in the end, I had narrowed it down to one question. I looked at her across the metal table and asked it quietly, "Did you ever love me?" She looked down at the table. She was still for a long time. The room was almost silent, just the distant sound of a door closing somewhere in the building. She did not answer. And in that silence, I understood something I had been circling around for a year without quite reaching it. She had paid $20,000 to erase me. She had sat across from me at dinner tables and at holiday gatherings and in my own living room, and she had been planning it the entire time. But she was the one sitting behind a metal table in a pale green room. And I was the one who stood up, pushed my chair back, and walked out through the door into the open air. I drove home with the windows down. The afternoon was cold and bright and completely ordinary. I was still here. That was enough.